and then I'm quite patchy. I had an interesting time a couple of years back. I was so foolish as to say to the chair of the Historical Writers Association that I was feeling rather out of touch with historical fiction because I've been reading, a lot of memoir, and partly, has helped to write my own, and partly because I was then teaching creative nonfiction and memoir and all of that. And I should not have said this to Imogen Robertson, because she promptly said, "Well, do you want to chair at the Historical Writers Association Gold Crown?" Which did mean that I then had to read lots and lots and lots, because I think we had 100 and
Oh gosh.
130, 140 submissions.
Mm.
I had lots of fellow judges, and we divvied them up between us. And partly because I was chairing anything that didn't seem to have had enough reads for us to feel that we were making a fair judgment between them all. I sort of dived in and had to pick up enough of, and that was absolutely fascinating. And some of them were so good. I particularly enjoyed Rebecca Stott's Dark Earth, which is set in what, you can't call the Dark Ages anymore, but the gap after the Romans, in London, and what isn't London anymore. And I thought that was an extraordinarily fully imagined of a world that's very difficult to imagine because there are no written sources.
No.
And until recently they were the Dark Ages because they weren't either Roman or Renaissance. They didn't really count, and people didn't write about them. And
Could you give us the title again?
It's called Dark Earth. Rebecca Stott, who actually is
Right.
also a fantastic memoirist. She wrote a brilliant memoir called Days of Rain, because she was brought up in the Plymouth Brethren.
Right.
And then when she was about, I don't know, 12 or something, the whole sect that she was in, which was the strictest, most rigorous version of it, had a sort of big blow up, and her father just upped and left, and he'd been quite senior, and just took them all out abruptly. Fascinating book, beautifully written. So I loved that. I loved Sally Gardner's The Weather Woman. That was another one that was a treat off that list. And we did end up with a short list, and a long list and a short list that we were really proud of. After that, I somewhat went back to not reading a huge amount of fiction because I was starting to work on the current thing.
Yeah.
Do you find that you pick up story elsewhere? So do you watch a lot of narrative drama TV, for example?
No, I mean, I grew up without a TV.
Yeah.
So I don't, and then, I've had one ever since I was, in my student, I suppose, but I sort of forget that it's there to be watched.
Yes, me too.
If you see what I mean? There isn't a kind of TV-shaped space in my evening unless, we look at each other and say, should we watch some telly, as it were? But I actually think I get a lot of my narrative kick from nonfiction. I mean, at least a third of what I read, maybe even a half, would be nonfiction. And particularly social history.
Yep.
I had a big kick of reading creative nonfiction and non-nonfiction, if you see what I mean, about textiles and clothes. And Shahida Bari's book about dress, and all sorts. There's a lovely one. I can't produce all the titles, but really good creative nonfiction, I think, fulfills a lot of what I enjoy. There's a wonderful Julian Barnes based on a sergeant portrait of Dr. Piozzi, the one in the red dressing gown. Yeah, which is, I mean, it's a brilliant painting, but it's a brilliant book. And so many fascinating ways of tackling nonfiction, questions and issues. I mean, I do think, much as I love novels, I do think in some ways the most innovative stuff that's going on in creative writing is in creative nonfiction. There seem to be fewer rules about how it needs to be, about the storytelling. It doesn't have to be storytelling in the formal beginning, middle, and end in quite the same way. You get to make your own rules of engagement.
Yeah, to the extent actually that as I was writing mine, I was a member of a group where we sort of workshop bits and pieces, and I kept getting the feedback of this sounds too much like a novel, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
And which I was fine with, because I was deliberately aiming for a very sort of story, because there's a lot of big events. It made sense to have a very sort of story-driven piece, but the sort of reflective it's a spectrum, isn't it? I mean, I hope that mine is also reflective, but the sort of the reflective, often structurally fragmented end or creative nonfiction, there's some very, very interesting things.
Mm.
I think the relationship between the narrator and the characters is more. You can be more explicit about it.
Yes.
I remember when I finally realised that built into the problem of the family novel, it wasn't just that I was a crap writer or didn't know how to do this stuff, or certainly shouldn't be teaching anyone. It doesn't do any good.
Sounds like quite the crisis of faith.
Well, it sort of was a bit of a crisis, but and then eventually I realised that it was actually built into the project that I would never be able to do it for reasons I won't bother to go into now. But that writing non-fiction, I did want to write non-fiction about this stuff, and so I set to on that, and it actually wrote itself incredibly easily. But I remember very clearly a point fairly early on when I was thinking about the structure, how to structure it, because it was a messy sort of project. It was about me, and it was about the novel that I was trying to write, and it was about the historical members of the family tree who I was trying to write fiction about, and all of that. And I suddenly thought, but the thing is, I can talk directly to the reader and I can explain what I'm doing. And I had a vision of the Pompidou Centre. And I thought, I can wear my drains on the outside. When you're building a private house, all the drains, all the wiring, all the switches, it's all behind plaster. It's all hidden. And when you're writing a novel, when we talk about technique in writing novels, most of the time what we're doing is talking about stuff that the reader is not aware of. You don't want the reader to be aware of how you're getting them to buy into this story.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want the reader the knowing reader, other writers, obviously, if they want to, but you don't want the reader. You're trying to make that trust fall into reading it as if it's true, when we know it's a novel and therefore, by definition, it's not true.
And it's fascinating. It's fascinating, that, isn't it? So as it happens, I've taken to listening to long books on audiobook at night at the moment. So I went through the whole of War and Peace. I've gone through the whole of Middlemarch. I just finished it yesterday. And those big 19th century novels are much, much more clear about having the drains on the outside of the building. They will tell you, it's a bit, excuse me, it's a big sort of authorial perspective, but they will be happy to say, this is what I, as the author, am obtruding into this narrative now. And yet current novels are much, much more loath to do that.
Yeah. Well, one thing one has to remember about all those 19th century novels is that for every person reading it, there's 4 people sitting around listening to it because they can't afford that many candles.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Or because they're older and their eyesight is going and somebody's reading for them.
The husband is, the father's reading it and everybody else is mending the sheets.
Yeah.
For example.
Or doing their needlework or whatever. And plus it's coming in installments because they're all being serialized. And so you have to keep catching people up and reminding them who's who and what's what. I think it's true, and one of the things that's really interesting about memoir and creative nonfiction is that we still have that relationship. You can still in a memoir sort of say, I can't remember what happened, but it felt like this.
Yes.
And everybody will wear that. That's what that's you wearing it's like saying I'm this is how switching the light works. And the cable or whatever it is.
Weirdly, it actually adds to your credibility, because one of the things I was incredibly conscious of writing memoir is that you have to make a scene sort of live as you would in a novel, and therefore you need to, I don't know, say something about the decorations on the walls of the room that you're in and the type of lights coming through the window, and realistically you're unlikely to remember that, and so you are sort of making it up, and your reader is aware of it because they also know you can't remember what that was like in that room in 2015, but by saying I can't quite remember, but I feel as though the room must have become warmer at that moment, you're both saying I don't know what happened, and also increasing your reader's credibility because you're admitting to not knowing what happened, and therefore they're more likely to believe that the room did get warmer at that moment. It's such an interesting interplay.
Yes. Well, it enables people to make the trustful with people who you feel you can rely on, and that can include being honest about what they don't remember.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about your novel, which I haven't read yet, though I want to. how much did you feel that your main character was just in the moment, or do they have a separate consciousness from slightly outside? Sorry, I haven't put that very clearly. I think what I'm thinking of is that when you've got a first person narrative, you've always got that person as the narrator, as well
Yeah.
as that person as like a character, as an actor, if you like.
Yeah.
And however much it's only implied, they're standing they're standing in one place when they're telling the story, and then there's them, running around doing whatever the action of the story
Yeah.
makes them do. And I
Yeah.
think there's an endless spectrum, and down my way I talk about it as the psychic distance spectrum, though people also call it narrative distance and emotional distance, various other things, of how much you make the reader aware of the person telling the story, that they're telling it, if you see what I mean. That they
Yeah.
say, I can't remember, or later I thought about, or but you can also just be completely in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with this character, this protagonist, I think she's very much I think she is honest about like the feelings, like it felt like this, or I don't know if she's explicit about not remembering. I feel like she's she thinks she's very sure about like this is how it happened.
Yeah.
I think that's what she does. Yeah, but I think the reader will be very much aware that because it's on the outside. She's telling the story as I'm gonna give some things away, like she's been expelled from school and it begins there. So you know that she's been expelled. Now you just want to know what happened and how did she get to this position. Yeah, so she's in a place of the anger that comes with being, so she's very sure about like her story or her narrative. So yeah.
Would you call her an unreliable narrator or reliable narrator?
I wouldn't say she's unreliable because she is, some of the characters in the novel, I would say are unreliable, like the mother. She'll say something and, and contradict herself, but I wouldn't say Nomanda is unreliable. I wouldn't position her as an
People are very, very sure that somewhat invites the reader to think, oh yeah,
what really happened,
or not necessarily what really happened, but there is another angle possible.
Yeah, I mean the reader will definitely come out with an angle, definitely.
And I think the reason I asked was because of Treasure. Because at first reading,
okay,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
At first reading, you're sort of, okay, here's this other character, and then things shift. And then you discover, hang on, but is this? And that's what I mean in that sense.
Okay.
She's giving us, she's telling us something, and then gradually you discover that it is her reality, and at the same time there's a kind of irreality going on. I don't want to give away any plot spoilers. I don't want to give away too much, but if you see what I mean.
I also, there's this thing about her as well where she presents as a neurodiverse person, right? And so the way she experiences the world and the way she experiences grief is it's interesting the way she she experiences those things, and I think the reader will be right in thinking, was Treasure real, and I mean, even for myself, I don't know there, like I wouldn't be able to give you an answer as to
and of course that sometimes you just want to unsettle the reader a bit, but not tie everything up tidy and explain it all and make it all very neat.
It's also
the fascination,
the writer's experience of it, isn't it? I love the idea that writers always know exactly what they're doing and they're deliberately trying to create all of these effects to do all of these things. And sometimes we are. And at other times, something appears on the page. So I know that this is right. I know that I should leave it on the page, but I can't tell you why this is the right
Why?
thing.
No. Occasionally, actually, a reader, particularly a friend or something, has nailed why, and I thought, oh yeah, I suppose that is why it works. But I just felt it worked,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is nice. It makes one occasionally think that one actually knows what one's doing, which is
Yes.
always a comfort.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
This is
Beautiful.
so interesting because I've never really saw Nomandla as reliable or unreliable. I mean, it will be so interesting to talk about this some more.
Yeah.
John Mullen, the critic and literature journalist, has a very interesting book called, I think, How Fiction Works, though I'd have to look it up to be sure. It's one of those titles. And he makes the distinction between an unreliable narrator who is lying and what he calls an inadequate narrator, who is someone, and his sort of prime example is Christopher in The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, because Christopher is very, very neurodivergent, and he would never, he can't lie. He does, he absolutely is completely factual, and so and a brilliant observer, but he can't interpret what he observes. So he relays everything with absolute truth and kind of with no agenda, nothing except this is what I saw. But of course he can't interpret it, and part of the interest of that book is the reader interpreting what he can't interpret. And of course children would be another example of inadequate narrators, or inadequate viewpoint characters.
That's what she is, I think.
Is that okay? Okay.
And I think it's very useful. It's because one of the ways of drawing the reader in is to get them to interpret things in other ways than what's officially on the page, if you like. Andrew Stanton in his TED talk, he's Mr. Pixar, did things like Wall-E, and he talks about how the reader wants to work for their meal, but they don't want to know they're doing it. You give them the 2 + 2 and they make the 4, but they don't want to feel demanded of. It's just actually it needs to be them who makes that final last bit. It's like it's like a joke. If you have to explain why the punchline is, it doesn't work, but you want the reader to get the punchline. You don't want to make it yourself. The reader get why it's funny, I should say. And I think inadequate narrators are fantastic. Like child narrators are brilliant. I don't know if anyone's read Henry James' What Maisie Knew.
I hated that book. It's the one and only book I've ever thrown across the room.
Yeah. I mean, I can see why. And a lot of people don't get on with Henry James, but it is absolutely fascinating the way he manages, even in his incredibly sophisticated Jamesian prose. It's not that it's a child's voice, but the way that he conveys the fact, because it's no big secret her parents' marriage is coming apart, and she becomes the sort of she kind of gets shuffled between the two in your typical kind of Henry James posh Euro-American world, and so she shows absolutely straight that Maisie makes some kind of connection with the fact that when her mother comes in to say goodnight, her dress is sometimes high and it's sometimes low on her front, and whether it's high and whether it's low varies depending on what kind of man's voice it is on the landing.
I should go back and reread it. I read it as an undergraduate.
And from that, I mean, it's a good example of how you don't need to be in a certain voice. You don't have to sort of lock it down to a 6-year-old vocabulary, though you also could. To use an inadequate narrator to convey stuff that the narrator doesn't understand, that viewpoint character doesn't understand. Sorry, it's got very technical. Sorry about that.